Hey y'all, today's guest is Paul Hawkins. Paul is the Deputy CEO of Attitude is Everything. Attitude is Everything is an organization that champions accessibility and carving out a space for people with disabilities to get involved in the music industry. Whether that's working in the music industry or playing in bands or even attending shows, their mission is very cool and this conversation was a blast. As always, if you want to support us, you can do so at tapeclub.substack.com. All right. Enjoy my conversation with Paul. All right, Paul Hawkins, welcome to the show. Our first ever international guest. I was telling you this before we started. So stoked to have you on. Thank you for doing this.
No, I'm really excited to be here, and it's really, really great you've asked us. Thank you so much.
So I wanted to talk about, obviously, Attitude is Everything. So big picture, let's start at the beginning. What is Attitude is Everything? What is the mission, and how are you involved there?
Okay, so we are a charity in the United Kingdom. We work to improve access to the music industry for disabled people, and that's for artists, audiences, people who want to work in the industry, people who want to volunteer. And essentially what we do is we work with disabled people, listen to disabled people's feedback, and then work with the industry to find practical solutions to address the barriers that stop disabled people from being involved in music and live events.
And that makes sense, and it's a very important mission. So I imagine you've had some personal experiences that have informed your work with Attitude is Everything. Could you tell me a little bit about an early experience or something that was a breakthrough moment that shaped your vision for what accessibility should be in music? Something that made you realize this isn't just a conceptual thing. There are real life implications, real world implications to accessibility.
Yeah, and I can talk about myself here. So I'm involved because I'm a disabled person who, for a lot of my life, I've been a musician, or at least trying to be a musician on the side whilst doing other things. When I was a teenager, I couldn't camp at music festivals due to my access requirements. So I had a lot of my friends going off to music festivals together. And then that has a big social impact, because your friends are going off somewhere you can't go to. And of the they're having an amazing time that you can't be a part of. But also they're making friends, they're kind of bonding, then they kind of come back and you feel a little bit more distant from them. And then as I started to play music, it became very clear to me that things like touring, for example, were very tricky because with the way that I'm disabled, I need my own bathroom all the time. I need a decent kind of bedroom. When you're touring, there's an assumption you're going to be kind of crashing on people's sofas. It's going to be, or in a van or whatever. And for a lot of people, that's not practical. And then you just can't afford to do it. And then I think the third thing I talk about in terms of our workplace side of it is, when I started working when I was younger, I was terrible at most jobs I did because, I'm not, for various reasons, I find certain aspects of administration, certain bits of day-to-day tasks quite tricky. And, and nothing was being put in place for me. And I kind of just thought I was failing. And then when I started working for disability-led organizations and people started putting things in place, I actually realized that I was, kind of quite good at what I was doing. And now at a kind of decent level professionally and kind of feel fulfilled in what I'm doing in a way which it's very hard to get to if people are writing you off at the kind of beginning of your career.
It was one of those things where it wasn't that you were failing. It was sort of like the system was failing you because there was nothing in place to make it equitable, I guess.
Well, this is it. And we work off what's called the social model of disability. And the idea of that is that people aren't disabled by the conditions or impairments they have, but that society disables people because barriers are created. And if you remove those barriers, then people will still have the same conditions, still have the same access requirements, but they're not disabled in the same way because there's not those external barriers stopping them from doing things.
Yeah, I mean, that's a great point. I want to go back to that music festival you mentioned. Do you remember, we don't have to say what the festival was, but do you remember when that was around?
Yeah, so that would have been about 1998 or 1999. And actually was everything was founded in 2000. So it was one or 2 years before it started. And one of the strange things is even though I'm not going to say what the festival was, it is one that I have subsequently worked at for Attitude is Everything and gone to. So that was quite cool,
Yeah, that sounds amazing. It kind of came full circle, and it kind of leads into what I was going to ask. So how have you since then noticed, have you noticed you've obviously noticed changes in the way that accessibility is approached by these festivals. What are some of the ways that it's changed that people may not think of, because I mean, it's more than just like ramps and risers, you know what I mean? Like what are some of the ways that accessibility has changed over the last 25, 30 years that people don't think about?
Okay, cool. So I'm going to start by keeping it quite simple, which is actually a huge part of just the information which people have got, because, it's one of the main things we ask people to do is put information on the website about what they've got in place for disabled people, and that's not the kind of coolest or the sexiest thing, but it does give people the information to know whether they can attend events, whether they need to request some of the things that are really important. One of them is personal assistant tickets. So basically, if someone's going to a festival and needs someone to go with them, then provide an additional ticket at no extra cost, so that someone can go without having to buy 2 tickets. A second thing, or some of the other things, an accessible campsite is really important. So a space where people can camp with accessible toilets, accessible facilities. One of the things people might not think about or know about is what's called changing places units, which are basically they are larger toilets with changing tables and hoists, so that someone who can't use a standard toilet or a standard accessible toilet has got a place where they can get the toilet needs met. Also, a really big thing in the last few years is quiet spaces, so making sure there's somewhere where neurodivergent people, anxious people can go and just kind of have a quiet or a sensory space to kind of relax and recuperate and recover from the festival environment. Also, British Sign Language, or obviously not in American Sign Language in America, but sign language, really, really important. Also audio description, potentially captioning, so lyrics coming up on screen, so things like that, so people who can't, kind of necessarily access either the visuals or the audio performance can kind of still get a sense of what's going on. You mentioned ramps, and certainly viewing platforms are really important. But with viewing platforms, part of that is about wheelchair users, but it's also about other people might need to sit, and also people who just need a space away from the crowd. So one of the things that can surprise people sometimes is that there may be people dancing at the back of viewing platforms, always at the back, so that people who are sitting at the front can have a good view. But there may well be people who can't be in a crowd, but do want to, kind of still want to stand, maybe want to dance. But also, one of the big things with viewing platforms is the ability to lean. I think sometimes people don't really realize that actually for some people, it's not about whether it's not about having a seat, because a seat is not always the most comfortable thing. Sometimes it's actually about something you can actually kind of lean on and rest on, and that can make an even, kind of bigger difference. So they're some of the major things. And then also the other thing I'll quickly mention is distance and how things are laid out. So basically making sure that when someone is arriving, when someone's parking, they don't need to travel a long way carrying kind of heavy belongings and things, and that they've got somewhere simple where they can kind of drop off their stuff close to the car. And with all this, I think what I should say is I'm talking about festivals. We work with venues and festivals. I worked on our festival side for 5 years, so I always lapse into talking about festivals, but we do work with both. And the thing that I've also left off that's really, really important here is training. So making sure that security staff and stewards have got really clear information about how to, how to work with disabled customers, because that customer service side is key. And what you don't want to happen is someone to feel dismissed or invalidated, or have someone say, well, you don't look disabled, or I don't think you should be using these facilities, because that can really, like that often when we have mystery shoppers going to venues and festivals, it's that customer service side which kind of really impacts people the most. If you go somewhere and the facilities aren't great, it's obviously inaccessible. It's obviously impacts your experience. But if someone invalidates you as a person, it obviously feels inherently more personal.
Yeah, 100%. I mean, it's, to me, what is so interesting, I guess, about what y'all do is that, you just listed off a ton of things that y'all do, and at their core, they're like so simple. It's like, just think about it, But I feel like a lot of people just don't have an experience, whether that's a lived experience or being adjacent to disability in their life, that they don't even consider these things. Like the very first thing you brought up about the having like that extra ticket, right? That is so easy. That's such an easy solution. It makes so much sense. And like a festival can eat the cost of like a couple tickets here and there. That's not like a huge thing to them. So it's it makes perfect sense what you all do, and it's very important, I think, to like open people's eyes to it. One thing I do want to discuss is the Live Events Access Charter, which I believe, you can correct me if I'm wrong, is like a framework that y'all have sort of put in place to make it easier for festivals and venues to like, they have basically a framework with which they can start approaching these issues. Can you tell me a little bit about that and kind of the process of building that?
Yeah, and that's exactly right. That's what it is. So basically, when we started as a charity, we were sending mystery shoppers to venues or festivals to give us feedback. And then we'd meet with those festivals and venues, and we'd talk about what practical solutions they could put in place to address that feedback. And over time, kind of we built a base of knowledge of, here's the things which come up the most often. Here's the simple solutions you can put in place. And the charter, as you say, is a framework for codifying that. So we kind of, it started off as a simple pledge, I think, for the first kind of few years. From about 2010 onwards, it became more of a framework where people assessed it, bronze, silver and gold levels. And then a couple of years ago, Alex, who is our head of live events access, and her team did an amazing piece of work reworking the charter to make it, first off to incorporate some new technology. We're working off kind of Excel sheets and things that just weren't very easy to use, but then to make sure it was kind of thinking about artists and professionals as well as audiences, and it was, kind of understandable for people how to complete. And the idea now is that it's a framework for, how to do accessibility well, informed by the experiences of disabled people who've given us feedback.
And so this obviously started as a more UK-centric thing. From what I can tell, it's become a more global thing through things maybe like the Live Events Access Forum. But before we get too international about it, why don't you explain to the viewers a little bit about the difference in disability legislation in the UK and in the US?
Yeah, so basically, and this is the big challenge we have when we do international work, is you're always working with slightly different frameworks. And a lot of disability legislation is based on the UN Convention for the Rights of Disabled People. So there are some similarities, but the fundamental difference between UK law and American law is the Americans with Disabilities Act, and UK it's the Equality Act, is the Americans with Disabilities Act is, as I understand it, quite a prescriptive piece of legislation. So basically it says you need to make things accessible. These are the things you need to do to make things accessible. You must do these things. And that works really well in some ways, in that it makes very clear what people's responsibilities are. Where it doesn't work quite so well is if things that fall between the stores slightly, when experiences change, when new practice develops. Obviously it takes time to codify that into law. So it's very precise, but then kind of doesn't always respond to nuance. Whereas UK legislation is the absolute opposite. So basically the Equality Act says you need to make reasonable adjustments for disabled people. It does not tell you what a reasonable adjustment is. The only way of finding out what a reasonable adjustment is, absolutely definitively, is if something gets taken to a court, and and a judgment is made, and then that becomes what's called case law and sets a precedent. But that never really happens because it's expensive and risky for people to do. And any venue or festival that's being taken to court, in most cases, will try and settle to avoid reputational damage. So basically, no decisions ever really get made, or very occasionally decisions get made. But a lot of what we have to work with venues and festivals to do is to work out what is likely to be a reasonable adjustment. What when they say you've got to make reasonable adjustments, what do we think this means? How do you prove what you're doing is reasonable? Which is a real challenge, because, you're never certain if you're correct on some of these things, and you're never absolutely certain if your guidance is right. The simplest way that we try to advise people is to try and do everything they possibly can to meet any request. So if a request comes in to make a reasonable adjustment, what you do is you sort of see if you can do it. If you can't do it, you think, is there another way I could do this? Is there this option or that option? Kind of talk to some colleagues, go back to the customer and say, we've got these options, they work. If the customer says those don't work, see if there's anything else you can think of. And basically, if you've really in good faith tried to do something and you can't find a way to do it, probably not a reasonable adjustment, but it's always a slight kind of, it's slightly ambiguous thing. So UK law is slightly tricky for disabled people to navigate because you never quite know what your rights are.
Yeah, it's ironic that the legislation exists, but it sort of makes things even murkier in a way. I mean, it's obviously positive that it exists, but there are cracks, there are gaps, and I guess y'all are there to sort of fill those in. One thing I wanted to ask, so obviously the difference between how it's approached in the US versus the UK is different. I'm sure you go to other countries, the laws are even more different, and some might not even really have things like that. Because you guys do international stuff, tell me a bit about the Live Events Access Forum. Am I correct in thinking that's trying to bring the charter to an international audience, or is that sort of misguided?
It's along those lines. So basically, the Live Events Access Forum is something we started last year with organizations in Canada, in the US, an organization called Ramped, also in Australia, New Zealand, and the Netherlands. Basically, what we're trying to do is bring together. So for a lot of our 25 years of existence, we've generally struggled to find other people in other countries doing kind of comparative work. Now there's a few people out there, and it's basically trying to share knowledge. And obviously, we've been developing the charter for years, and particularly with Morvenna, who is the person we work with in Australia. We've done quite a lot of work in supporting her on how to build a charter out there. But it's all what we've realized is it's always about kind of translation, if that makes sense. I mean, you couldn't pick up and transplant the exact model we've got and make it work in another country. It's about how do you take the learning of what we've done and make it, I mean, some countries you could, but how do you take the learning of what we've done and kind of adapt it and make it work for where you are? So for example, my understanding of the US, and obviously, as I say, I'm in the UK, and my understanding of the US may not be right in some aspect, but because it's the Live Events Access Charter is a national framework, which, we're a national organization. My feeling is with the US, because things are organized much more along state lines, there's a lot more focus on kind of cities, local communities. It would need to be a slightly different model, which kind of is about kind of what cities are doing, or, kind of what states are doing, rather than bringing in a kind of national framework. Because I think kind of probably within the US, with the variances between states, I think that would be quite a tricky thing to do.
Yeah, I mean, I agree with you. I think it would be tricky. And also, not just even the differences between states, but I guess it plays into the differences between states, but just the variety of venues and festivals that you have is just like nuts. And really, this is something I've gotten into in the past on different episodes, is about my personal inability to ever tour. I could never do it. I do not want to drive that far. I don't want to be in a van for that long with so many people. And so earlier you were talking about doing it with a disability, and that just blew my mind, because I'm like, oh my God, that's true dedication to the art, because it's touring in any form is just way too much for me. I appreciate it, and I think that what y'all are doing is very cool. I do want to talk a little bit about something called Beyond the Music. So correct me if I'm wrong, but this is basically a professional network that Attitude is Everything has built. It helps people with disabilities find opportunities in the music industry. What sort of outcomes have you seen from that, and how long has it been around?
That's right, yeah. So it started in 2020, and it also runs parallel to a project called Next Stage, which supports disabled artists as well. So, which has been running slightly longer. And basically, as you say, it's a way of getting more disabled people working and represented in the music industry. The biggest impact we've had with it is with an aspect of it called the Future Leaders Program, which is where we work with 10 or 11 people each year who've got, I was talking about this earlier, people who've got leadership potential, but however you define that, but for various reasons of access requirements might not be succeeding in their kind of early career roles. And essentially we try to give people skills, knowledge, mentorship, learning opportunities to kind of take their career further. Some of those people now do work as access consultants, work as trainers, work kind of various kind of artist management things, other things in their own right. The other aspect to it that's probably worth talking about, which I think is where we've also had quite a big impact, is we produced an accessible employment guide a few years ago. And when we started doing that work, there wasn't really anyone. We didn't know many people in the music industry who were openly disabled working in professional roles. We knew a couple of people, but not many. And generally there was a culture that if you were disabled in the music industry, you wouldn't talk about it because lots of jobs are insecure. There's quite a lot of freelance work. And essentially there was a fear that if people think that there's additional barriers with recruiting you, maybe they won't do that. And what has seriously shifted in the last few years is the number of people in the music industry talking about their access requirements and talking about the fact that they are disabled, particularly, but not just neurodivergent people. And also there's some organizations now, who are doing some great work, really kind of spotlighting kind of disabled people and providing opportunities. There's an organization called Accessible Events we do quite a lot of work with who, kind of actively provide opportunities for disabled people to work across the industry. We provide some placements with Beyond the Music as well. So we are shifting the dial in that way, I think, which is really, really positive and really exciting. And we've got some funding last November from a funder in the UK called the Esme Fairbairn Foundation to do some work to develop disabled leaders in the music industry, so to take people in roles in the music industry at the moment and develop them as leaders, which feels like a really exciting piece of work. Because one of the things we know from the research we've done and other organizations, there's a artist management company called Harborside Management did some research a few years ago, and essentially a lack of role models in the music industry really stops disabled people going into it. So, having disabled people in leadership roles is absolutely key to people thinking they can succeed as well. And I think the bit that we've not really cracked quite yet with it, which I think is the other challenge with it, is there's still a lot of stigma stopping disabled people from applying for jobs in the music industry in the first place, because it's seen as quite a, maybe not when you work in it, but if you don't, it's seen as quite a glamorous industry and quite a cool place to work. It then ends up with, kind of people who've had inaccessibility in education or early careers, kind of having people around them saying, don't set your sights too high. You might not succeed in this. Shouldn't you kind of adjust your expectations? And that kind of creates its own barriers, to it's how you stop people from listening to the voices, both internally and externally, telling them they can't succeed. When I think genuinely the music industry in the UK is getting a lot better at enabling disabled people to succeed.
Yeah, I mean, I like what you said there about, there being a lack of the role models or the people to look up to in those spaces. It's like if you don't see someone who has a similar lived experience to you ascending to these roles, like without just from the get, you're like not on the same playing field because you're not even really considering like what could be. So I think that's cool that with Beyond the Music, you guys are sort of building this out. One thing that I find interesting, it seems like y'all have a model where you approach a problem maybe, and you start building these solutions. And once you've like kind of made your way through it for some years, you then, once you've kind of started getting a foothold, getting some success, you then go to create a framework and teach others about it, is what it seems like. Because, you know, you said with Beyond the Music, you guys are creating a guide, right? And then the Live Events Access Charter also is another way to like teach others about it. So I just think that's really admirable, that like the next step is always learning, like teaching others and like, you know, kind of keeping people informed. A couple questions here before we go to the break, a couple sort of quick ones, although they could get a little deeper. We'll see. What advice would you have for people facing a disability who want to get involved in creative industries that don't always have that space carved out for those people?
I think it's about, you know, I don't want to be too, you know, kind of sunnily optimistic and say everything will work out absolutely fine. But what I would say is the industry is more open to you being there than you probably think. And, you know, there's obviously in any job, in any role, there's always a possibility you'll meet people who make your life easier or make your life harder. But there are certainly in the UK a lot, and I know in the US, there's a network called Ramped in the US, which is a network for disabled artists and professionals. And again, you know, there are people there who want to support you, who want to help you learn and want to give you opportunities. So, you know, do give it a shot. And I think one of the key things with it is, you know, trying to, and I think this is where a challenge can come in. If it's accessible to you, getting to know people within your local music scene is a really, really good place to start. Obviously, if you've not got local venues to you that are accessible, this is where we run some programs we run. But if you've got venues you can access, getting to know the people there and getting to know how they work is a really good way to start getting opportunities. And, you know, in the UK, at least, there's often this perception that you need to kind of come to London to kind of do anything, which, you know, I'm saying this with a certain degree of irony because I'm from a small village outside a city called Bristol, and I did come to London to do things. But increasingly, you don't need to be in London to do things. So do kind of find out what's going on locally.
Well, you know, that's a great point that you always have to start local. I think in the US, it's a really similar idea. It's that it's New York and LA, right? Those are like the places, but there's such rich music scenes like all over the place. And really that's where you can have the most impact. You know, like if you pick up and go somewhere, it's even harder to have an impact. You're making your job 10 times harder. You know what I mean? In certain situations, right? And quick aside about Bristol. Is that where Sarah Records are from? Are they from Bristol?
Yeah,
maybe not.
I'm pretty sure they are. I'm sort of trying to, I think you're right on that. Yes.
That's like they're like my heroes, the people who made Sarah Records. That's just like my dream. I think we even on the Tape Club's About page, I think we even reference Sarah Records as like a model for what we want to do. So shout out Bristol. Last question. It's kind of a quick one, but it's a big picture one. What gives you the most hope about the future of accessibility in the music industry?
I think what gives me the most hope, to be honest, is the future leaders I talked about earlier. We've brought some amazing people through that scheme and kind of set them on the way in the industry. And some of those people are gonna succeed and are gonna reach kind of high levels in the industry and are gonna make an amazing change. And, you know, and I'd love to say that's because of the work we've done. And I don't, and obviously, I'm really proud of our role in it, but they will succeed because they're amazingly talented people. And I think what's really, really important is, you know, we can make the change we make, but it's about how we can develop the people who kind of come after us to kind of go further. And I think there's some amazing people who can do that.
Amazing. That's a great attitude to have. Hey, attitude's everything. I didn't even mean to do that, but that happened. Paul, thank you for the enlightening answers. Let's take a quick break. When we come back, we're going to get to your mixtape. All right, we are back with the mixtape. And Paul, tell me a little bit about any overarching theme you may have had for this mixtape.
Yeah, so basically I felt, because I'm doing this with my kind of professional hat on, I wanted to go with a series of songs that many of them are by disabled artists, not all of them, but in some way remind me either of my work or why I do it. So I'll sort of expand on what I mean of that as we go through them. But I think the theme is they're all sort of things that I feel connect to the kind of work that I'm doing.
Amazing. All right, well, let's start with the first one. This is a song called Nobody's Empire. It's by Belle and Sebastian off of Girls in Peacetime Wanna Dance, which I remember when that album came out. It's a great album. But tell me a bit about why you picked this one and your experience with Belle and Sebastian.
Okay, so I mentioned earlier that when I was growing up in the 1990s, kind of, I didn't mention this. I grew up in a small village and I was the only disabled person in that village. Didn't feel I kind of really fitted in. I think probably I felt I didn't fit in more than other people didn't feel I felt I didn't fit in, if that makes sense. But it was, Belle and Sebastian were kind of one of the first bands that I really connected with. And, I found out years later that Stuart Murdoch, is disabled. He's got a condition where he could be considered disabled under the Equality Act, which I did not know at that time, but certainly that might be why his music speaks to me. And, 2015, when I first started working for Attitude Is Everything, one of the first opportunities I had was to go and work at Glastonbury in my second week, which was amazing. And Belle and Sebastian were playing. That album had just come out. That is a song, essentially about disability. And watching my favourite band as a teenager do that on the stage, somewhere I'd not been able to kind of go whatever years earlier, was, right now I get emotional about it. It was absolutely incredible, and kind of just one of these moments of, I can't believe I'm here. I can't believe I'm doing this. So yeah, that's why I had to go for that song.
And then was that the first time that you saw Belle and Sebastian live, or had you seen them live before that?
It'd be a great story if it was the first time I'd seen them, but no, I'd seen them about 5 or 6 times already.
And then do you remember like what the first time you ever saw them was, where that was, or what era of Belle and Sebastian? Because they've got so many eras, you know what I mean?
Yeah, so that was about 2001. It would have been just after they'd released Fold Your Hands Child, I think. And and it was at the Pavilion in Bournemouth where I was at university. Weirdly, I'd bought tickets to go to Bournemouth to go to the gig and kind of stay on a couple of weeks extra at the end of the year. Then ended up in hospital and having to go back to Bristol, go back to Bournemouth for the gig while still recovering. So I was not particularly that well when I saw them, but I absolutely, it's incredible to see them, and it was a great gig. And, and then I've seen them a few times since, and then obviously at Glastonbury.
Yeah, you were dedicated. You were like, I'm not letting a hospital stay stop me from seeing Belle and Sebastian.
Yeah.
For me, I gotta say, my favorite album of theirs, Dear Catastrophe Waitress.
Such a good album.
Love that album. It's just like, what's beautiful about them is they can do the really stripped down stuff. They can do like more synth leaning stuff, or they can do that big, like, kind of, a lot of horn sections, a lot of string sections, chamber pop stuff. That is where they get me. I adore that stuff.
Yeah, and obviously it's a Trevor Horn produced album, and sort of having a kind of major pop producer trying to do, kind of doing their music ends up sounding so different from kind of what had preceded it.
Yeah, and I'm sure, I guess I don't know. I was going to say I'm sure that like a lot of their fans originally were turned off by that, but it hit me at the right time. I loved it. So, it's beautiful stuff. Let's listen to Nobody's Empire by Belle and Sebastian.
And she put out her arm. She touched me when I was in hell. When I was in hell.
Next up is a song called I Wait by Gaelynn Lea. Gaelynn Lea, actually, and I bring this up a lot, but I've got a long history with the music festival called Treefort here in the US. Gaelynn Lea played Treefort one year, so that was really cool. But tell me a bit about this tune and a bit about Gaelynn Lea.
Yeah, so Gaelynn Lea is from Minnesota, I think. She's an American artist and violin player, incredible songwriter, and she's someone who, I think she's the co-founder of Ramped, who I mentioned earlier. But she's also, she's someone who, when she's toured the UK, she's been in touch with Attitude Is Everything. We've done events for her before, and a few years ago there was an amazing event where she was in conversation with Suzanne Ball, who was our founder. It's an incredible thing to see the two of them talking, and then Gaelynn Lea playing afterwards, and she did this absolutely incredible set. I Wait is just, I think, again, a really, really good song about the experience of being disabled, and the way that basically the amount of time you spend sort of challenging the lack of accessibility of things, and then sort of feeling like you need to be nice about it, and you shouldn't kind of push too hard, but then why aren't you pushing too hard? And it's a kind of complex thing to kind of write a song about, and it really kind of absolutely, and I think she articulates it incredibly. It's such a great kind of articulation of that kind of, why on earth aren't things accessible, and why should I be fighting for this, Yep.
It's like, I don't know, I imagine it's one of those things where you're like, well, I don't want to be rude or anything, but you're like, just, it's such a weird disconnect. It's like you're advocating for yourself. How can you possibly be being rude? You're asking for like the most like basic things. Were you at that conversation between Gaelynn and who'd you say it was?
Suzanne. Yeah, I was. Yeah, no, I was, and it was. It was a really great conversation, and then a really fantastic performance.
Was there any moment there that stuck out to you, or anything about the conversation, anything you took away from it on that day?
I think the main thing was the universality of the kind of barriers, but also, just the challenge, going back to challenges of touring, there was a bit of a conversation about the challenges of just taking a flight as a wheelchair user. And every time Gaelynn Lea comes to the UK, or when Suzanne was our founder, when Suzanne would travel anywhere for work, obviously when you're trying to travel by plane, if you're a wheelchair user, your wheelchair gets stored, you kind of get left to the very end to be kind of supported off the plane. Generally things go wrong, the access really isn't there, and it's sort of and obviously there's lots of reasons kind of environmentally why it would be kind of great if people fly a bit less, but at the same time making sure that people have got the right to do kind of basic right to travel. And I think the fact that a conversation about music actually kind of turns into a conversation about the basic right to travel, I think really just articulates how inaccessible basic rights can be to some people.
Oh yeah, 100%. I mean, I remember back, this was, about over 10 years ago, but it was the first job I had in New York, and one of our coworkers was a wheelchair user, and I remember we just doing something simple like going out to lunch. Like we'd take the train, a couple stops, and he'd be like, "Oh, I have to get off at the next stop because that's the only accessible stop." And then from there he has to come back and meet us at the lunch spot. And I was just like, "What?" Like it blew my mind, because again, I was just ignorant. I'd never considered these things, and I was like, "Wow." Yeah, I don't know. That's a lot of it, right? I think a lot of people are just ignorant, and not through any fault of their own, not through malice or anything. They just literally don't think about it.
But you just don't notice what you don't see, do you? And if you're going around and able to get everywhere and do everything, you don't realize how some people can't,
Yep, 100%, 100%. Let's listen to a little bit of I Wait by Gaelynn Lea.
That history won't forget us or try to minimize our pain, and so I wait.
Next up, we have Freedom by Miss Jackie. So tell me a bit about this one.
Okay, so there's a little bit of, bias is the wrong term here. Miss Jackie is our co-chair at Attitude Is Everything. And she is a, kind of poet and performer. And, I'd kind of known her for a few years before actually hearing her music. And as soon as I heard her music, it was absolutely jaw-dropping. And Freedom in particular is such a brilliant kind of expression of the the kind of intersection of kind of race, disability, gender, and I just think it's an absolute, basically it's just one of the most powerful songs I've ever heard. Is all I'm going to say.
I always think it's interesting when there's music industry companies or people who work in like music industry adjacent places, whatever. I always find it interesting the breakdown of who was in a band or is in a band or is an artist or does something versus the people who aren't. Like, for example, we had a guest on last season, Patrick McCarthy from A to Z Media, and they do a lot of like pressing, duplication, merch stuff. And he was telling me that like a lot of people there are in bands and they are artists. But then last week we had on a Bailey from Pink Street Management, and she's a manager, an artist manager. And I was like, have you ever played in a band? And she was like, no, that's not, like, I don't do that. And I was like, that's so strange. So I guess my question is, what is the breakdown like at Attitude is Everything? Are most people active musically and they make music, or is it a lot of people who just want to be involved and like want to help?
A fair number of us who do make music. I mean, I'm not sure on the exact percentage, but certainly I can immediately think of 3, 4, 5 people in the organisation that do music or performance to some degree on a kind of regular basis. So we certainly do have a fair share of kind of musicians amongst us. And I think this is one of the things that kind of I've talked about a bit with the team over the last few years, because we've got our artist network and our professionals network. But increasingly, if you're an artist, you need to do some level of kind of professional work, either to sustain your career or because, artists don't have kind of big teams in the way of years ago. If you're a professional, very often you are doing that to support a music career, or you want to do some music as well. So it's sort of, the line is really blurred between artists and professionals. And I think certainly Attitude's Everything, that's true as it is in a lot of places in the music industry.
Yeah, and that low key is kind of one of the goals of this show, is to provide DIY artists with ideas of where they could go in the music industry, that it's not like all or nothing. You don't have to just be an artist or get out. That's not really how it works. You can find your way in doing other stuff. It's a massive industry. Back to Miss Jackie real quick. Have you seen Miss Jackie perform live, or is this mostly a recorded thing?
Yeah, no, I've seen her perform a couple of times, and I've, in my slight side thing of occasionally promoting gigs, I've put her on as well. And, she is a brilliant performer. And, anyone in the UK who books gigs who's listening should book her.
You guys should do a Attitude is Everything showcase where everyone does their stuff. 'Cause I know you make music too.
Yeah, no, that would be cool. And I will talk a bit about my music shortly. I've snuck in a song I've got a kind of performing connection to in a bit, but we'll come to that when we get there.
All right. We won't tease it too much. Let's listen to a little bit of Freedom by Miss Jackie.
To make change. Freedom, rebellion is doing what you want, even if it means you might shift people out of their...
Next up, a song called I'm Normally Like This by Alt Black Era. Tell me a bit about this one. I remember this one really jumping out at me when I listened, because the energy is palpable. But tell me a bit about this one.
Yeah, so Alt Black Era are a band who... One of the artists is on our Next Stage network, our artist development network, and has advocated for some events. And, they won I think they got to number 1 in the UK metal charts, and, won an award, I think Best Alternative Act at the Music of Black Origin Awards last year. And they're, a disabled act really succeeding in the music industry. Absolutely incredible live. I saw them at Glastonbury last year, and they were phenomenal. And again, I think their music just sort of really, I'd actually not seen them or heard them before Glastonbury, but I'm normally like this in particular, but music in general just really jumped out at me. As you say, it's so energetic, so powerful, so bold, so kind of clear in its statements. And it's just I just really love this song.
when I hear music that's this full of energy and this powerful, the first thing I think about is like, man, having to perform this for like 40 minutes or more every night for like on tour would be so draining. Because, you know, for me, I like to sit when I play, I guess is how I put it. You know what I mean? Like my music is like for sitting down to. It's not energy, you know, whatever. So it's just, it's wild, you know, it's very, very energetic stuff.
And I think that's a really interesting thing. I don't want to, like I said, I don't want to talk about Old Black Era here particularly, specifically because I've never had a direct conversation with Nairobi about it. I know others in my team have met it, but basically, you know, there are a lot of disabled artists with fluctuation energy who, will find that act of going on stage very challenging, very draining, still do it because they love doing it. But then, you know, what people don't see is the kind of recovery that then comes afterwards. And I don't know if that applies to Nairobi or not, but as a general point, I think, that point, you know, I think sometimes with disabled artists, people don't quite see the unseen bits of recovery.
Yeah. And also, I mean, even bigger than that, right? It's like there's this mythic idea of like rock stars party. And when you're like touring for like 6 weeks straight, you can't party every night unless you're like 21 or 22 maybe. But like when you're like, no offense to young people, but when you're like a real adult, you cannot do that every night. You have to like drink tea, go to bed. Like that's it, you know? So yeah, but I hope Alt Black Era are taking good care of themselves when they tour because it is high energy stuff. Let's listen to a little bit of I'm Normally Like This by Alt Black Era.
Now I don't give a damn if they like it or not, baby. I'm normally like this. I don't give a damn if they like it. I'm normally like this.
Next up is Jeffrey Lewis, the legend Jeffrey Lewis and the Voltage with Exactly What Nobody Wanted. So tell me a bit about this one.
Yeah, so this is where last year I finally went on tour after years of not touring as a musician. I ended up supporting Jeff for and his band for a few gigs around the UK. It was my band, The Awkward Silences, and it was an amazing thing to do because obviously Jeff is phenomenal, but also because, you know, I'd never toured before and that was just so much fun. And I think what's nice doing it when you're older is I think if I'd done it when I was a bit younger, it would have been kind of, okay, what's next? How am I going to build my career from here? Whereas doing it now, it's just kind of, oh, this is amazing. I'm just going to really enjoy the fact I'm doing it. But, yeah, and why I chose this particular song, Exactly What Nobody Wanted, is because I really love it as an articulation of that thing of kind of seeing something that, you know, you think is absolute genius, absolutely incredible, which doesn't kind of connect with the wider public. And I think there's something for, you know, kind of, you know, people who are really, you know, when you kind of, as someone who enjoys kind of any kind of art form, those moments where you discover something and you think, God, I think this is amazing. And no one else seems to. And I just really love how this song sort of talks about that.
Yeah, I mean, that is art kind of in a nutshell. You know, for me, the most recent example of that was last year I discovered a band called Micro Disney who are just so fucking good. They were only around for a short while in the 80s. And I went to like look at, and I know this isn't really a big metric, doesn't really matter, but I looked on Spotify and they have like under like 2,000 listeners or something. I was like, how? This band should have been as big as like the Smiths. This band is incredible.
Yes. Cato Coughlin, isn't it?
Yes.
Sadly passed away a few years ago. Now, I've know some Fatima Mansion stuff, which he did afterwards, I think, and then a little bit of his solo stuff. And he did some stuff with Luke Haynes a few years ago, which I did see live, but I haven't actually listened to Micro Disney, and I probably should.
You definitely should. Yeah, I mean, they're incredible. But he is he was such an icon. Like, I'm kicking myself that I didn't know about him until, you know, after he passed, because I would have done anything to like go see him perform live, you know. He just seemed like such a smart dude and like so down to earth. And, you know, I think in a lot of his interviews, maybe what people would misconstrue as pessimism, I think was just like him being, philosophical and just intelligent. And it's like, he's not a pessimist. He's He's just like seeing the world for what it is. But this is not a micro Disney podcast. It could be, but I want to ask real quick the Jeffrey Lewis thing. So first of all, so many things. He's an icon, right? He's been doing stuff for so long, and he has carved his own path. He is very firm ethically about what he believes. He's just a legend, right? But for you to get to go and open for him, I love that you mentioned like having the understanding of it as, being older, knowing that this is the moment. It's not about what's next. This is the moment. That's such a like healthy way to think about it. But tell me a bit about that tour, just briefly, like how many nights and where did you guys go, and any memorable stories from that?
So we actually only did about 5 or 6 nights. It was a 13-night tour, and then another band called David Cromer's wife, who we're friends with, did, and actually we've got some shared members with, did the other half of the dates. And we played in Leeds, Bristol, which was really cool, playing in Bristol, London, which was amazing. We played in Cambridge, we played in Leicester, and we played in Margate, which is a small seaside town in Kent. And yeah, it was great. It came across. So Jeff is releasing stuff in the UK on a small label called Blang, which I've also released things on. And essentially, at some point, he came across my music. And it's what we were talking about before, where, no one else seems particularly interested in my music, but then Jeff seems to quite like it. He's obviously a kind of a big deal, So suddenly you ended up kind of getting a chance to do this tour, which was absolutely awesome, because suddenly, when I do gigs a lot of the time, it's sort of to, kind of a handful of people. Then suddenly you're in kind of crowded rooms in kind of really cool venues. And it was just, just a joy,
Yeah. Were your hands shaking on stage with that many people out there? Or how was it? I imagine maybe the first couple nights nervy and then sort of settled in.
First couple of nights, really, really nervy, then settled into it. Then we ended up with Jeff wanting to come on stage with us and playing one of our songs, which was just absolutely kind of, and then it's sort of off, kind of terrifying, but also, Jesus Christ, this is incredible.
Yeah, that's amazing. And then, they're there to see you, right? So like you're running the room, though, which is awesome. I imagine the Bristol show was like pretty surreal. That was probably the takeaway.
Yeah, but it was also, my mum was there, which was always kind of that strange kind of connection between kind of your kind of family, seeing what you're kind of doing your days off, and, but that was a really cool gig. And, playing a gig in Bristol to a crowded room, having kind of grown up there, was absolutely awesome.
That's amazing. Well, shout out to Jeffrey for bringing you on. Let's listen to a little bit of Exactly What Nobody Wanted by Jeffrey Lewis and The Voltage.
You had a vision that was clear and directed, and the ways it worked were all unexpected. You were unbelievable and you were undaunted, and you were exactly just what nobody wanted.
And finally, the closer track. The closer track is Getting Away With It All Messed Up by James. So usually I feel like people pick a closer track for a reason. Why was this the end cap to your mixtape?
So it's because it kind of encapsulates the, and James, to my knowledge, nobody in James is disabled. I could be wrong on that, but basically it kind of encapsulates both the experience of being disabled and the experience of working for a small charity, in that basically the entire time you're kind of winging it, and it's just about working out. And, I've seen James at multiple festivals. I'd never seen him live till I started working for Attitude Is Everything, and then kind of saw him at a couple of festivals. And now if they're on a festival bill, I will absolutely definitely watch them. But it's just that song's always become this almost kind of slight kind of personal anthem for me, of kind of, we're doing this. We got through it. It was chaos. It all looked like it was going to collapse at various points, and we're still here, still doing it. And I'm kind of probably talking both about working with small organizations and kind of managing my access requirements when I say that. But it just, I've just really, that is kind of how it feels, that getting away with it and it's all messed up is exactly how it feels.
James are a group, right? It's not one guy called James.
They are a group. They're quite a mid-sized kind of cult band from the UK. So came through around the same time as the Smiths, and allegedly the Morrisseys, We Hate It When Our Friend Becomes Successful, is about when James had a big hit before kind of Morrissey had one. But I don't know how true that is. But but they're a kind of cult band that have been going now for 30 odd years, and they pull a decent crowd, but obviously kind of, that kind of level of band, which probably is harder to resist in the same way now, where you're kind of, you've got a lot of fans, but you're making a decent living from doing it, but you're not a kind of superstar. Whereas now it feels like there's much more of a schism between things that are kind of local and things that are kind of huge,
Totally. The disappearing middle class of music, that could be a whole show in itself, because like, I will say one of my hot takes is that like, people think immediately as soon as they record an album and put it on streaming, they should be getting like paid like crazy money. And it's like, dude, there's so many people making music. Like this is like, it's the model is not as simple, I guess, as it was in the 70s and 80s, where it's like form a band, start touring, get noticed, get a record deal. Like it's not that anymore, right? So to see a band like James, I had no idea that they're from the 80s and still doing it. To see a band with that longevity is just so inspiring. It's very, very cool. Let's listen to a little bit of Getting Away With It All Messed Up by James.
Getting away with it all messed up. Getting away with it all messed up. That's the living.
And there we go. That is your mixtape, Paul. Any honorable mentions that you couldn't fit in there?
God, now that's put me on the spot. There are absolutely loads of honourable mentions, and I've now immediately, my mind has gone blank the second you've asked me about them. But
I know I gotta say, this is the thing that last time I did a show, I was like, you know what? Note to self, in the pre-show prep, let me tell the guest that I'm going to ask about honorable mentions, and I forgot to do it this time. So that's on me. But now that you've had a second to think about it, any honorable mentions, or are you happy? You're happy with this 6?
I'm happy with my mixtape. I think those were the songs I wanted to go for. I managed to mention David Cronenberg's wife. I always try and kind of plug in things. Also, actually, I'm going to mention, in terms of people who, kind of, when we talk about people who work for us, one of our team performed under the name of Electricity and has a song called Lighthouse, which is absolutely incredible, which I might have put on a mixtape that's the one song that I thought halfway through, I should have put that on the mixtape.
Well, I will say you could have if you'd come on in the first season, because I used to say 10 songs. And then I remember I had one guest, a friend of the show, Mara Davis, and she was like, 10 is a lot. And I was like, no, 10's great. She was like, you should do 6. And it took me like a whole season and a half to be like, it's got to be 6. We can't do 10 every time. It's too much. So if you'd come on earlier, you would have been able to put it on. But now it's an honorable mention. Very honorable nonetheless. Let's take a quick break. When we come back, we're going to play a game, and then we will get out of here. All right, we're unveiling a new game today. This game is called Call and Response. It is our version of a word association game. Nothing too crazy, Paul. I'm just going to say a word, and then you tell me what it makes you think of. So the first word is touring. What does touring make you think of?
See, I've already talked about what it really makes me think of, which is, obviously me getting a chance to do it, but sort of moving away from kind of my ego and going back to kind of our work. I think it's the importance of kind of making sure that there's funding available for disabled people to meet additional access requirements when they do tour, so that people aren't unable to tour due to financial barriers.
Great answer. Next word is algorithm. What do you think of when you hear the word algorithm?
I'm immediately thinking about kind of AI and the challenges. And I think that came into the streaming conversation earlier, because one of the things I was kind of thinking about then is the fact that, you know, if you're an artist, a lot of the routes to making money from music kind of keep drying up one by one. And often it started out with people not buying records due to kind of people downloading things, and then kind of difficulties of kind of making money from touring. And, you know, and then what you had left was kind of syncs. And then obviously with AI and kind of people able to get AI generated music instead of using artists, the challenges that's going to create around people being able to kind of make a living through kind of syncing and royalties. So probably not a cheerful answer, but that's what I immediately thought of.
No, we are in for a wild ride in the next decade. It is going to be nuts. The next word, what does this make you think of? The word is success.
Success. I think what it's immediately making me think is we need to reframe how we think about success. I think particularly within music, because I think it's kind of what I was kind of touching on before. I think very often you get artists who think, you know, I need to succeed, but every level of success feels like you've got to get to that next level of success. And I think sort of as someone who's now in my kind of, how old am I? In my early to mid 40s, less early now. But anyway, I think that I realised that I've done quite a lot of cool stuff through being a musician without ever objectively succeeding. You know, I've kind of had music played on the radio. I've done a radio session. I've done the tour I mentioned earlier. I've played a couple of festivals, and, you know, and objectively, subjectively, in most people's terms, I've not succeeded. I'm not a famous musician, but I've done some really cool stuff. And I just worry about how easy it is to miss the cool stuff, because you're kind of always focusing on, am I at the right level yet? Yeah.
The idea of success comes up on this show a fairly decent amount. And, my take on it is always like, it's what you make it. I know that sounds so cheesy and corny, but really, like, are you enjoying every day? That's success, in my opinion. Who knows? Next word. We only got a few of these left. So the next word is actually two words. Green room. What does that make you think of? Green room.
Green room, again, it just showed that I'm really in work mode. It makes me think about the importance of backstage accessibility, and the fact that very often people don't think about the fact you've got to make the stage accessible for performers, but also ensure that performers have got a place to rest, which is accessible for them to get to. And very often, kind of disabled performers, even if they can access a stage, may find that they're not able to access a green room. So thinking about that backstage access as well. I do promise sometimes I do not think about disability, not very often, but occasionally.
Well, I mean, look, you're in such a role that you have to, it's you're a champion, for it. So it makes sense. The next word is metrics. Metrics.
I think what that makes me think about is an impending nervousness, in the sense that, when you work for a charity, you're always thinking about how do you measure your impact? How do you prove I'm succeeding? What are the kind of metrics that show we're doing what we're trying to do? And it's something that, we're trying to get better at. But I think, in all honesty, pretty much every charity is always trying to get better at, because there's always, we can get the metrics better. But I think it's that thing of how do you kind of, you move on from success to how do you quantify and show that success?
Yeah. I, for work, am a filmmaker, mostly in post-production, and a lot of projects I work on are judged very much by their metrics. And a lot of those metrics are very public facing. So it's like views and stuff like that. And, I hate metrics. I hate them. I think they are such a terrible way in my industry. They're such a terrible way to measure impact. It doesn't make any sense. Finally, the last word isn't really a word, it's an abbreviation. DIY. What does that make you think of?
I think that word gets me excited, because it makes me think about the kind of the music scenes that I first kind of got involved with, that kind of made me love music. And just the fact that, kind of stepping away from the conversation about success. I think and I think also answering one of your questions earlier about the advice you give people, I think, again, it needs accessible venue for this to work. But, I think for a long time, I thought playing a gig was hard, putting on a gig was hard. And actually, you want to play a gig, you kind of show up and do it. You want to put on a gig, you kind of contact someone and do it. And it's actually a lot easier than you think. Maybe it's harder to do it well, but actually to do, to kind of put on your first gig, to do your first performance is actually really easy, and really a lot easier than anyone thinks.
I forgot who I was talking to, and I'm kicking myself because they put it in such a great way. I wish I could give them credit. Sorry, whoever you are. They described it to me once as the actual act of playing the show is like the eye of the hurricane. It's the calm in the middle of the storm. They're like, everything leading up to it is tough and crazy. Everything afterwards is wild. But right there in the middle, the gig is the calm part. And I was like, I never thought of it that way. It's like a great attitude to have. Paul, thank you for coming on the show. I really appreciate it. It's been such a great conversation. Can you let the people know what's coming up and where to find you, where to find Attitude is Everything, how they can keep up with y'all?
Yeah, so we have, unsurprisingly, you'd assume, we have a website, which I've suddenly blanked on the actual web address, but it's attitudeseverything.org.uk. We also have on there our mailing list and other things within it. So, my wording has gone there. So you can sign up to our mailing list to find out what we're up to via there.
Amazing. Listeners, viewers, as always, I always plug these at the end, but we got our little cassette tapes that we make. Every quarter, we have a bunch of artists who submit music, and, here's the track list. Sorry for the listeners, but the viewers can see. Here's a track list from the December mixtape. We send these out quarterly, along with some other tapes. If you want to support, you can do so at tapeclub.substack.com. It's a great place to sign up. You get this podcast, you get a newsletter, you get a radio show that comes in, you get the mixtapes, you get everything. It's a great spot. Paul, thank you so much for coming on the show. This was a true pleasure. I want to give a shout out to our new associate producer that we brought on, Olivia Stonier. Olivia couldn't have done this without you, so really appreciate it. And listeners and viewers, as always, thank you for listening and viewing, and I'll see you next time. Peace. The J-Card podcast is a fully independent production. It is made possible by listeners and viewers just like you. So if you want to support us, tapeclub.substack.com is the place to go.